We'll now go through a practice exercise where we'll learn how the application of overhead occurs, and we'll also see how that transcends into a cost worksheet. Let's go through the problem that we're going to use as our practice exercise here. We have a company by the name of Super Plastics Molding, which began operations recently, just last month. And the company makes durable plastic containers, and in their first month of operations they incurred the costs that you see here: direct materials of $100,000, direct labor of $50,000. They applied manufacturing overhead of $150,000, which gave them total costs of $300,000. And during that month, the jobs that were transferred or completed and transferred to finished goods totaled $225,000. The jobs that were transferred were taken care of through a job order costing system. So they do use job order processing. And they apply overhead on the basis of direct labor costs. Well, at the end of the first month, there was only one order remaining in process that hadn't been transferred over to finished goods, and that was the Sleuth Enterprises project. And during that first month, the Sleuth job itself incurred $12,500 in direct labor costs. Okay, so that gives us some background information on the problem. Let's take a look now at what the exercise is going to require us to do. It's two parts. First part, compute the predetermined overhead rate that was used during the first month of operations. So we need to first determine what the overhead rate was used. We know that they apply it based on direct labor costs, but we want to see what the rate is. And then in part two, we want to complete a job order cost sheet for the Sleuth Enterprises project as of the end of that first month of operations. And the format that we'll use will be to add up the direct material, direct labor, manufacturing overhead for the Sleuth Enterprises to see what the total is at the end of that month. Well, let's start with part one. In part one, we're going to compute the predetermined overhead rate. Well, we know that $150,000 of overhead was charged or applied to production during that month, and that was based on the $50,000 in direct labor costs. So using the formula of overhead that's applied divided by the direct labor, we can come up with our rate. And we know that 150 divided by the 50,000 is going to be 300%. So our overhead application rate is 300%. Let's move on to part two. Part two will take in a few steps. Step one, we want to determine what the total would be for the work in process at the end of the month. Now we know that we incurred $300,000 in expenses and that we transferred to finished goods $225,000. So that leaves $75,000 in costs, and the problem told us that the only project that was open was the Sleuth order. So that means that the Sleuth order is the only order, and it's at $75,000. So we can immediately put into our job order cost sheet that we know the Sleuth order will total to $75,000. So we're going to be working backwards here from the bottom to the top. Let's move on to the second step. In step two, another fact that we know, in addition to the $75,000 in being the total cost, we also know that the Sleuth project incurred $12,500 in direct labor costs during the first month. And so we can immediately put the $12,500 into the direct labor line. The other piece that we also know is that based on that $12,500 and using the 300% rate that we calculated in part one, we can use that overhead rate and multiply it times the $12,500 of direct labor, and we will come up with $37,500 of manufacturing overhead that needs to be put into our equation here. So now we have two parts to the cost sheet. We have the $37,500 of manufacturing overhead, the $12,500 of our direct labor, and Now the only thing we need to do is to calculate the direct material. And again, using the concept of working backwards, let's move to the third part of this. If we take $75,000 and we subtract the 37.5 and the 12.5, we come up with $25,000 as our direct material. And that will complete our worksheet, so that we now can turn in the worksheet and tell them that $75,000 is in the sleuth project, and we know what the cost components are for each of the pieces of the $75,000.